In the vast, unforgiving skies above occupied Europe during the Second World War, survival was never guaranteed. Fighter pilots faced odds that would break ordinary men, where split-second decisions meant the difference between returning home or becoming another statistic in the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare. But on one particular mission in 1943, a single Allied pilot would face odds so overwhelming that his survival would seem impossible. 10 Messerschmitt Bf 109s against one lone fighter. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a masterclass in tactical brilliance, split-second decision-making, and the kind of aerial combat that would be studied for decades to come. This is the story of how one pilot's unconventional approach, his so-called lucky charm strategy, allowed him to outfox 10 of Germany's deadliest fighters in a whirlwind dogfight that defied all reasonable expectations. Flight Lieutenant James Lucky Johnson of the Royal Air Force's 401 Squadron was anything but a rookie when he climbed into the cockpit of his Supermarine Spitfire, Mark 9, on that crisp September morning. With 23 confirmed kills to his name, Johnson had earned his nickname not just through fortune, but through an almost supernatural ability to emerge unscathed from engagements that had claimed the lives of less fortunate pilots. His aircraft, marked with the distinctive squadron codes and adorned with a small four-leaf clover painted beneath the canopy, was a finely tuned extension of his will. The Spitfire Mark 9 was one of the finest fighters in the Allied arsenal, equipped with the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine that gave it superior performance at high altitudes, and armed with two 20mm Hispano cannons and four 303 Browning machine guns. The mission briefing that morning had been unremarkable. A routine fighter sweep over northern France, designed to maintain air superiority and draw out German fighters while bomber formations returned from their missions deeper into occupied territory. Johnson's flight had taken off as part of a four-aircraft formation, standard procedure for such operations. But war has a way of turning the routine into the extraordinary with brutal efficiency. Communication failures and the chaos of combat had scattered his flight. One pilot had returned early with engine trouble, another had been diverted to escort damaged bombers, and Johnson's wingman had become separated during a brief engagement with a pair of Focke-Wulf 190s that had appeared and vanished into cloud cover just as quickly. Now, at 24,000 feet, Johnson found himself alone. The sky around him appeared deceptively peaceful, a vast expanse of brilliant blue stretching endlessly in every direction, broken only by scattered cumulus clouds that dotted the horizon like cotton wool. His radio crackled with distant transmissions, other pilots engaging in their own battles miles away, their voices tense but controlled. He scanned the sky with practiced efficiency, constantly checking his 6 o'clock position, the area behind and below where enemy fighters preferred to attack. The sun hung high and to his right, and he positioned himself carefully to avoid being silhouetted against it. Everything seemed calm, almost serene. Then came the moment that would define his life. A glint of sunlight on metal, high and to his left. Johnson's blood turned to ice as he counted them. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 10. Messerschmitt Bf 109. Gustav Models, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter, arranged in a loose formation and diving toward him with unmistakable intent. They had spotted him first, held the altitude advantage, and possessed numerical superiority that made engagement suicidal. The Messerschmitts, with their distinctive angular lines and predatory appearance, were already committing to their attack run. There would be no escape through speed alone, no friendly fighters to call for assistance, no clouds close enough to hide in. Johnson was alone, outnumbered 10 to 1, and the nightmare had just begun. The Messerschmitts closed with terrifying speed, their formation splitting into two groups as they executed a textbook bracket attack designed to eliminate any escape route. The lead elements opened fire at extreme range, their cannon shells and machine gun tracers creating brilliant streams of light that reached out toward Johnson's Spitfire like deadly fingers. The sound of his own engine became almost a physical thing, roaring in his ears as adrenaline surged through his system. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to dive away and try to outrun them to the deck where the Spitfire's superior turning ability might give him a chance. But Johnson knew that running would be fatal. The Messerschmitts diving from above would simply chase him down, using their altitude advantage to build up speed and pick him apart with coordinated attacks. Instead, Johnson made the first of many counterintuitive decisions that would save his life. He turned into the attack, hauling his Spitfire into a brutal climbing turn toward the lead Messerschmitts. The maneuver caught them off guard. Most pilots would have dived away, seeking safety in speed and altitude loss. By climbing into them, Johnson disrupted their carefully calculated deflection angles, forcing them to readjust their aim mid-attack. Cannon shells passed harmlessly beneath his wings as he clawed for altitude, his Merlin engine screaming at maximum power. The turn was so tight that the G-forces compressed his body into the seat, graying his vision at the edges as blood drained from his head. He grunted and tensed his muscles, fighting to remain conscious, every fiber of his being focused on maintaining control. The Messerschmitts flashed past him, their speeds too great to match his turn. But Johnson had no time to celebrate this small victory. The second group was already repositioning, and the first group would be coming around for another pass within seconds. He snapped the Spitfire into a rolling dive, using the energy from his brief climb to accelerate while simultaneously changing direction. The maneuver was instinctive, born from hundreds of hours in the cockpit and dozens of previous engagements. He could feel the aircraft responding to his every input, the controls firm and precise, even as the airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour. The psychological pressure was immense. Johnson could see Messerschmitts everywhere he looked, their distinctive yellow engine cowlings and black crosses marking them as hunters while he was the prey. His mouth was dry, his hands gripping the control stick with white-knuckled intensity. The rational part of his mind understood that he was likely going to die here, that the odds were simply too overwhelming. But another part, the part that had earned him his nickname, refused to accept that outcome. He had survived this long not through recklessness, but through a combination of skill, awareness, and an almost preternatural ability to read the flow of aerial combat. If he could maintain his composure, if he could continue to make the right decisions, there might be a chance. As the engagement evolved into a swirling furball of aircraft, Johnson began to recognize a crucial weakness in his opponent's tactics. The Messerschmitt pilots, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, were attacking aggressively but with limited coordination. Each pilot wanted the kill, wanted to be the one to shoot down the lone Spitfire. This natural competitive instinct, combined with the difficulty of coordinating 10 aircraft in a fast-moving engagement, meant they were beginning to interfere with each other's attack runs. Johnson had seen this before in unbalanced engagements. When one side had overwhelming numbers, individual pilots sometimes became careless, assuming their comrades would finish what they started. Johnson's lucky charm strategy, as it would later be called, was not about luck at all. It was a deliberately cultivated approach to aerial combat that emphasized unpredictability and exploitation of enemy expectations. While most fighter pilots were trained to fly smoothly and efficiently, conserving energy and maintaining formation integrity, Johnson had developed a style that was deliberately erratic and unconventional. He would mix high G turns with sudden barrel rolls, combine climbs with snap rolls, and execute maneuvers that seemed random but were actually carefully calculated to deny his opponent's predictable shooting solutions. His Spitfire, with its excellent roll rate and tight turning circle, was perfectly suited to this approach. Now, surrounded by enemies, Johnson pushed this strategy to its absolute limits. He flew his Spitfire as though it were an extension of his own body, throwing it through maneuvers that bordered on reckless but were executed with absolute precision. When Messerschmitts attacked from his left, he would roll inverted and pull through, reversing direction while simultaneously changing altitude. When they attacked from above, he would pull into a vertical climb, using the Spitfire's excellent power-to-weight ratio to gain altitude before rolling off the top and diving away at a different angle. Each maneuver was different from the last, creating a pattern of movement that was almost impossible to predict. The specific advantages of his Spitfire Mark IX became critical factors in his survival. The aircraft's elliptical wing design, while complex to manufacture, provided exceptional lift characteristics that gave it a tighter turning radius than the Messerschmitt Bf 109 at most speeds. Johnson exploited this ruthlessly, entering turns that his opponents simply could not match. The Messerschmitts, with their higher wing loading and tendency toward harsh stall characteristics, had to be flown more cautiously in high G maneuvers. Johnson had no such limitations. He knew his aircraft intimately, understood exactly how far he could push it, and flew right to the edge of its performance envelope. His audacious maneuvers began to have their intended effect. Messerschmitt pilots found themselves unable to maintain sustained tracking on the wildly maneuvering Spitfire. Deflection shots that should have been routine became exercises in frustration as Johnson would suddenly change direction or altitude just as they were about to fire. The German pilots' radio discipline began to break down, their communications becoming heated and confused. Several times, Messerschmitts nearly collided with each other as they converged on Johnson from different angles, forcing them to break off their attacks to avoid fratricide. The engagement had now lasted nearly 6 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat where most dogfights were decided in seconds. Johnson's fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, the Merlin engine's consumption at full combat power draining his tanks at an alarming rate. But something remarkable was happening. The tight formation of Messerschmitts that had initially attacked him had dissolved into chaos. Individual aircraft were scattered across several thousand feet of airspace, each pilot trying to position for a shot while simultaneously avoiding collision with his fellow hunters. The swarm had become disorganized, and disorganization created opportunity. Johnson recognized the shift immediately. Where before he had been purely defensive, focused solely on survival, he now saw chances to briefly reverse the dynamic. When a Messerschmitt overshot him after a failed attack run, Johnson would briefly point his nose at the retreating fighter and fire a quick burst, not necessarily expecting to score hits, but forcing that pilot to maneuver defensively and break off his attack. This created precious seconds of breathing room while other attackers repositioned. Each small, tactical victory bought him more time, more space, more opportunity to survive. The Messerschmitt pilots' confusion grew as Johnson continued to defy their expectations. They had expected a brief, decisive engagement. Instead, they found themselves drawn into an extended turning fight where their numerical advantage seemed increasingly irrelevant. The pilot who could maneuver most aggressively, who could outturn and outthink his opponents, was dominating despite being outnumbered. Some of the German pilots began to demonstrate fatigue, their attacks becoming less aggressive as fuel concerns and the accumulated stress of the engagement took their toll. Johnson employed what he would later describe as the one-on-one illusion, a technique where he focused his defensive maneuvering against whichever Messerschmitt posed the most immediate threat, effectively treating each attack as an individual duel rather than a massed assault. By focusing his attention on one attacker at a time, responding to that specific threat with maximum aggression before transitioning to the next threat, he created the impression of fighting multiple separate engagements simultaneously. This required extraordinary situational awareness, maintaining a mental picture of the positions and relative threats of all 10 enemy aircraft while simultaneously flying his Spitfire at the limits of its performance. The critical moment came when Johnson recognized a weakness in one particular Messerschmitt's attack pattern. The pilot, more aggressive than his companions, had made 3 separate attack runs, each time approaching from a slightly predictable angle. On his 4th attempt, Johnson was ready. As the Messerschmitt committed to his attack, diving from above and behind, Johnson executed a brutal brake turn followed immediately by a reversal, positioning himself briefly on the Messerschmitt's tail. For 3 precious seconds, Johnson had a firing solution. His thumb pressed the firing button, and his Hispano cannons barked, 20mm shells reaching out across the diminishing distance. Strikes sparkled across the Messerschmitt's wing root and fuselage. Smoke began streaming from the German fighter as it rolled away, trailing darker smoke as the pilot fought for control. The damage to one of their number changed the dynamic completely. The remaining Messerschmitt pilots, who had been pressing their attacks with aggressive confidence, suddenly became more cautious. The realization that their prey had teeth, that this was not going to be the easy victory they had anticipated, introduced hesitation into their tactics. Johnson recognized the psychological shift instantly and exploited it ruthlessly. He pointed his Spitfire's nose toward the nearest gap in their formation and pushed his throttle to maximum emergency power, the Merlin engine's supercharger screaming as he accelerated away from the engagement area. The Messerschmitts pursued, but their formation was too disorganized for an effective chase. Several pilots attempted to intercept his escape vector, but Johnson's careful energy management throughout the engagement meant he had sufficient speed to evade these attempts. He dove toward a layer of clouds that had been slowly forming during the engagement, using every bit of his Spitfire's speed to reach their protective cover before the Messerschmitts could close the distance. Cannon shells and machine gun fire followed him, tracers arcing through the sky in deadly streams, but none found their mark. He plunged into the clouds at over 400 miles per hour, the world suddenly dissolving into a gray void. Johnson eased back on the throttle, allowing his speed to decrease while he checked his instruments. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the engagement beginning to fade and leave weakness in its wake. He flew by instruments for several minutes, changing course multiple times to ensure no one could follow his trajectory, before finally emerging into clear air at much lower altitude. The sky around him was empty. He had survived. The journey back to base was flown in a daze, Johnson's mind replaying the engagement over and over, analyzing his decisions, wondering at his survival. His fuel gauge was alarmingly low, the needle hovering near empty as he finally spotted the familiar landmarks that meant safety. He brought his Spitfire in for landing with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, the wheels touching down on the grass field with a gentle bump that seemed almost anticlimactic after the violence of the engagement. The aftermath was marked by disbelief. When Johnson climbed from his cockpit and reported the engagement, his squadron commander initially thought he was exaggerating or confused. 10 Messerschmitts? Alone? And he had survived? Ground crews examined his aircraft and found evidence of near misses, several places where cannon shells had passed so close they had stripped paint. But incredibly, the Spitfire was undamaged. The official combat report, filed after debriefing and corroboration with radar tracks and other observations, confirmed the basic facts of his story. 1 pilot, 10 enemies, and against all reasonable odds, survival. The legend of Flight Lieutenant James Lucky Johnson and his incredible dogfight spread rapidly through the Royal Air Force and beyond. His tactical approach, The lucky charm strategy that emphasized unpredictability and aggressive defensive flying was analyzed and incorporated into combat training programs. Fighter pilots studied his engagement, trying to understand the precise combination of skill, aircraft knowledge, and psychological insight that had allowed him to survive. Johnson himself remained characteristically modest about the engagement, insisting that luck had played as large a role as skill, though those who knew him understood that his survival had been anything but lucky. The engagement offered crucial lessons that remain relevant to aerial combat even today. Superior numbers do not guarantee victory if tactics are poor and coordination is lacking. Unpredictability can be as valuable as speed or firepower. The pilot who maintains composure under extreme pressure, who continues to think clearly and make correct decisions even when death seems certain, possesses an advantage that transcends mere technical skill. Johnson had demonstrated all of these qualities in a single, extraordinary engagement that lasted less than 10 minutes but would be remembered for generations. His survival was testament to the idea that in aerial combat, as in life, fortune favors not just the brave, but the skilled, the prepared, and those who refuse to accept defeat even when the odds seem impossible.